Rules of filmmaking. Are you following them? Do you even know what they are? Well, I guess we'll see. So I have this unique idea of how I talk about the rules of filmmaking. For me, what I say is that there's a box. All your rules fit inside that box. Once you know the rules that fit inside your box, then you can kind of see where you can maybe bend that box, push that box, break that box, and step outside of that box. But if you cannot execute the rules that fall inside that box, your footage, your projects, your clients, it's all going to be disappointed. All of that's going to be disappointed. You're going to be disappointed. Why isn't my footage coming out like this? Why is it so bad? Why am I unhappy with this stuff? Why can I not execute what Joe is doing over here? Why are these YouTubers' videos look so much better than mine? The thing is that you have to follow the rules inside the box before you can even step outside of it. So there are 3 rules that we're going to tackle today. I believe that they're the fundamentals of filmmaking and that you have to execute these things. If you're not executing them, you're jumping the gun. You're trying to step outside of the box before even knowing the rules inside the box. Rule number 1, aperture. What is aperture? Aperture is your shallow depth of field. Basically, if you have something in the foreground that you're putting focus on, you want the subject or the objects behind them to be either blurred out or, depending on what you're shooting, you want everything to be in focus. Aperture has a setting on most cameras where you can adjust your aperture. So what's weird about aperture is the lower the number. So if we go from 2 to 1, let's say, lower the number in layman's terms, the higher that your aperture is, the more wide open it is. What the camera is doing is letting more light in so that it blurs out that background. Aperture is a fundamental piece of filmmaking. I believe it is one of the things that I've seen common in most beginning filmmakers make a mistake on. Because when you close your aperture or raise the number value, it makes things darker. And if you open the aperture or make that number lower, it'll brighten your footage or the object. So what normal people do is, or beginners do, is that they'll set up their subject. They'll be talking about their subject. They'll have everything set up, their lighting, their mic, their camera, all this stuff. And then what they'll do is they'll not know how to adjust their lighting. So what will happen is they'll close off their aperture, and then what will happen is that's how they light their subject. Now, in certain cases, that's not terrible. But I would say as a filmmaker, you're kind of more looking for that shallow depth of field. You want your foreground to be in focus and your background to be out of focus. It creates a more cinematic look, which is a term I don't really love to say, but it's a term that everybody is looking for. What is more cinematic? I will say having a shallow depth of field is a more cinematic look. The second thing is ISO. Most people don't know what ISO is. Okay, you have a little button maybe on your camera that will say ISO, and then you can raise it, okay, lower it, all this stuff. Now what ISO is artificial light. It adds light that isn't there. It adds a light in a room, outside, inside, whatever, that is not currently present. But it's digitally put in and baked in. Baked in means that it's slapped onto your footage. You cannot take it off. So it puts that artificial light onto the footage. Rough part about the artificial lighting, the ISO or ISO, is that it brightens your image, and what will end up happening if you keep pushing that image is that it will go too far. It will cause what we call as noise in the background. So you'll see it kind of maybe in your shadows down here or down here. You would see in the darker parts of your image, almost it looks like a film grain, like an old TV set. Maybe I'm a little too old, but the static, you'll see that kind of in the backgrounds of your shadows. And when you go into post-production, you'll realize, oh man, I can't use this footage, it was too dark, all this stuff, and you keep pushing it, pushing the highlights, pushing the shadows, trying to get an image that actually works, and you can't. You gotta throw away your image. You can't reshoot it sometimes, but hopefully you can. The hard part about this is that in these cameras, they're meant to go to a certain ISO. That's why you're seeing with these new cinema cameras, a lot of them have like what we call as a native ISO. Native ISO means that they shouldn't move out of that ISO. Depending on what camera you use, that could be anywhere from 800 ISO, 650 ISO, whatever. Generically, in most of these cinematic cameras, they're a lower ISO, unless you shoot on something that maybe is full frame camera, not a Super 35. You can maybe get a little bit more out of the ISO than you could with a Super 35. Or if you shoot on certain brands, for instance, Sony has tremendous ISO work to where they have established dual base ISOs, which means that in your higher resolutions and higher formats, you can go from your lower ISO, so for instance like an 800 ISO, and then like Sony can go up to way to like 12,800, which is completely insane. But they have the technology. I don't know, they're just smoking everybody in that category. But ISO, you want to be wary of it. You want to be wary of using it. It can completely ruin your footage. But if you don't know that, sometimes you'll just crank it, and then next thing you know, you're kind of crap out of luck. So the third rule is shutter speed. Shutter speed is different depending on what you're shooting, how you're shooting, and it's different for photography as it is for video. In photography, you can do certain things with a shutter so that you can slow things down to where it creates light like wands or whatever, or speed things up to get certain shots on your camera. But with video, if you're trying to just shoot a clean video, for instance, we're shooting in 24 frames for this YouTube video. Our shutter speed is at 50. It's always double what your frame rate is. So if I want to shoot something in slow-mo, let's say, I have two options with the camera we're shooting on. I can shoot it in either 60 frames or 120 frames. So at 60 frames, it would be 120. At 120 frames, it would be 240. Why this is important, please hear me on this, is if you do not change your shutter speed, you will put it in slow-mo or 60 frames or 120 frames, and you'll see little lights go like this across your screen. It also will freeze. It will look like you're watching kind of like a stop motion picture or something, like a little Legos moving a little bit like this, and your footage will be terrible. I see it as a very common mistake. Shutter speed is essential, especially when shooting in slow motion. And a lot of people are shooting in slow motion for certain things like weddings or events or music videos or what have you. If you don't change that shutter speed, your footage, you will notice, is not clean and smooth the way that you want it to be. So when you're shooting that and you shoot 60 frames and you see someone else shooting 60 frames, and you're like, okay, my footage doesn't look like that. Check your shutter speed. So inside that box, we've taught you 3 rules. Those are the 3 basic camera setting rules that I think most people should follow. There's others, there's more. Stay tuned for that. But those 3 things are the 3 simple basic things that I want to teach you inside that box. And now you know those things. Go out, shoot, use those rules. Okay? When you start to use those rules, you start seeing things come together, fall into place. Now, once you learn more rules, now you can start to step outside of that box, bend that box or break that box to where if you want to, if you're doing this aperture, but you want to do something else, and at least if you start from the basics of those 3, you have some sort of foundation. We're going to be creating more content like this. Basically, there's rules inside this box. It's just something that I use in my own verbiage. Is how I teach people on a regular basis how to shoot videos. If you can't follow the rules inside that box, then you'll never be able to step outside of the box. And so, for me, follow those rules and stay tuned because there's way more rules to come. Okay? And if you watch this video, thank you. We appreciate it. We love you guys. Please drop a comment. like the video, subscribe, check out our website, check out our merch, buy something, support us, do anything. Check out our socials. We're going to be posting on there regularly as well. And yeah, until next time, I'm Curtis.